A racist police officer picks the wrong black girl to humiliate at school, and what he didn't expect was that her father was an FBI agent. That one moment in the school hallway changed everything. It started with a smirk, a condescending stare, and a voice dripping with authority but empty of compassion. The officer stood there in his uniform, not as a protector, but as a predator in plain sight. He didn't see a child. He saw a threat. And worse, he saw an opportunity. There were students everywhere that morning. Lockers slamming. Shoes squeaking on the floor. The hum of conversation. Until it stopped. All of it. Silence fell like a wave when the officer reached for her backpack. No warning. No explanation. He yanked it off her shoulder, unzipped it with one aggressive pull, and flipped it upside down. Books, pens, a sketchpad, snacks, everything scattered to the ground like her dignity had just been dumped in front of everyone. The officer's voice rang out loud enough for the whole school to hear. "Well, would you look at that," he said, crouching down slowly, a fake curiosity in his tone. "No drugs today?" "Hm. That's a surprise." Then he looked her dead in the eye and said, "You're probably hiding something, aren't you? You people always are." Laughter. Not because it was funny, but because students didn't know what else to do. Some looked away. Some whispered. A few took out their phones. But no one stopped him. No one said a word. And she just stood there. Frozen. Her hands clenched so tightly they were trembling. Her eyes wide, not with fear, but with disbelief. Shame. Rage. That kind of helpless rage you feel when you know no one in that moment is going to speak for you. And that's exactly what he wanted. Because it wasn't the first time he'd done it. Maybe not this publicly. But the officer had been walking those halls for years, using his badge like a license to bully. Targeting. Mocking. Intimidating. Always with a smile that said, "What are you gonna do about it?" He knew most of those kids had no one. No power. No protection. But this girl? She was different. And not because she fought back in that hallway. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't even move. She just stared at him, eyes burning with a quiet fire, and walked away slowly, her things still scattered across the floor. That silence wasn't defeat. It was a warning. A storm was coming. And he had no idea what he had just set in motion. Because her father wasn't a factory worker. He wasn't a janitor. He wasn't absent. He wasn't afraid. He was watching. When that little girl walked into their home that afternoon, her father didn't ask what was wrong. He saw it in her face. The silence. The way she avoided his eyes. And when he asked, she hesitated. But eventually, the words poured out, cracked, halting, heavy with pain. By that night, he knew everything. And as an FBI agent, he had access to things most people didn't. Footage. Records. Backgrounds. Patterns. What he found was darker than he imagined. This wasn't just one incident. It was a pattern. A system. A school full of ignored complaints. Suppressed footage. Silent administrators. Students scared into submission. And a cop who had been protected by layers of bureaucracy and fear. But not anymore. Because this time, he picked the wrong kid. And what began as a humiliating moment in a high school hallway turned into a storm that would shake the entire district to its core. The agent began digging. Quietly. Carefully. Building a case not just to punish the officer, but to expose everything. Every cover-up. Every lie. Every administrator who looked the other way. The deeper he dug, the more disturbing the truth became. Because the officer wasn't just a bully. He had ties. Connections. Whispers of involvement with a far-right group that had quietly infiltrated law enforcement ranks. And this school? It had become their playground. He knew he couldn't just file a complaint. He couldn't rely on internal affairs. This had to be strategic. Flawless. Irrefutable. So he waited. He watched. He gathered. And all the while, the officer went on with his days, smug and unaware, still preying on students, still flaunting his power. But something felt different. He started noticing people looking at him longer. Whispering. Cameras lingering. And then, a meeting was called. The principal. The school board. The officer. And the father. What happened in that room? No one outside those walls knew the full details. But the fallout? It was explosive. Overnight, the officer's name hit the news. An anonymous source leaked footage of the hallway incident. Students came forward. Emails surfaced. Suddenly, the small school was on national headlines. Protesters showed up. Lawyers got involved. Parents demanded answers. Careers were destroyed. Secrets were revealed. And at the center of it all was the girl, the one who had once stood silently in a hallway, humiliated. But now, she stood tall. Unshaken. Heard. The very school that once allowed her to be violated by someone sworn to protect her now had no choice but to face what they had enabled. The story exploded beyond the school, reaching city halls, political debates, justice movements. Because this wasn't just about one girl. It was about every student who had been silenced. Every black child told to behave while their dignity was stolen. Every system that protected power over people. And the officer? Let's just say, what happened to him left the whole country stunned. He was about to learn that no badge can shield you from the truth. But the question still remains. What did the FBI agent do to bring justice, and what exactly happened to the officer that made the whole town freeze in shock? Stay until the end to find out. Before we begin today's story, we want to send a clear and heartfelt message to every black viewer watching: you matter. Your experiences matter. And your voice deserves to be heard. Here at Plow of Twist, we firmly stand against racism, bullying, and all forms of injustice. We believe in powerful stories that reveal truth, inspire change, and deliver justice where it's due. Now, sit back. You're about to witness a story that will shake you, move you, and make you think twice about who people really are. Don't forget to subscribe to Plow of Twist and hit that like button if you believe every voice deserves respect. Enjoy the story. The air in Baltimore, Maryland always carried a weight in late fall, a mix of cold wind, distant sirens, and the quiet tension that seemed woven into the concrete of the city itself. For 12-year-old Amara, that weight felt heavier when she walked through the gates of Eastwood Middle School. It wasn't just the pressure of school, or the looming final exams, or the typical teenage anxieties. For her, the heaviness came from something more silent, more invisible, but far more brutal, the kind of discomfort that didn't come with bruises or scars, but with long stares, muffled laughs, and the quiet isolation of being constantly misunderstood. Amara was the kind of girl who carried herself with grace, even when the world gave her reasons not to. Tall for her age, with rich brown skin and a quiet intensity in her gaze, she spoke only when she had something real to say. Her intelligence was sharp, visible not just in grades, which were impeccable, but in how she observed the world around her. She was one of those kids who noticed everything. The way teachers avoided eye contact during certain discussions. The way other students grouped themselves in clusters she was never quite invited into. The way adults always seemed surprised when she spoke with clarity and confidence, as if they didn't expect that from someone who looked like her. She had dreams, like any kid. Art was her world. Drawing was the language she felt most at home in. Sketchbooks filled her room, pages upon pages of faces, buildings, scenes she imagined, moments she wanted to remember forever. Her father had given her her first sketchbook on her 7th birthday, and she'd never stopped drawing since. That gift wasn't just a hobby, it was a bond. Her father, Malcolm, was her world. And not just because he was her dad. Malcolm was a man of structure, detail, and quiet strength. He worked for the FBI, a job Amara didn't fully understand when she was younger but had come to learn meant long hours, high stakes, and a strict code of integrity that he carried into everything he did, including fatherhood. Malcolm had raised Amara on his own since she was 5. Her mother had left, not dramatically, not cruelly, but with a kind of emotional absence that made it clear she wasn't built for the kind of life they had. Since then, it had just been the two of them. Their apartment in East Baltimore was modest, but full of warmth. Bookshelves lined the walls. A vinyl player spun jazz on weekends. The kitchen always smelled like cinnamon or something slow-cooked. Their world was peaceful, or at least it was at home. Outside those doors, Malcolm knew too well what waited. That's why he trained his daughter not just to be smart, but aware. Alert. Ready. He taught her how to read people. How to protect herself. How to hold her head up even when others tried to make her feel small. He never expected that those lessons would be tested so soon. Eastwood Middle was a magnet school, known for its strict rules, high expectations, and a disciplinary approach that often blurred the line between order and oppression. It was a school trying to look progressive on paper, diverse classrooms, slogans on the walls, equity programs listed in brochures, but within the halls, old hierarchies still lingered. Teachers saw some students and expected excellence. They saw others and expected problems. Amara quickly learned which group she was placed in, not by her actions, but by her skin. And then there was Officer Donnelly, the so-called school resource officer. A tall, broad man in his late 40s, always in full uniform even though he rarely left the front hallway. He was the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to intimidate. His silence did the work for him. The way he looked at certain kids. The way he followed them with his eyes. He called it monitoring. But everyone knew what it really was. Targeting. Amara had seen it. Felt it. And on a cold Thursday morning, she would be the next one in line. The day started like any other. Students filed through metal detectors. Backpacks were scanned. Officer Donnelly stood near the front door, arms crossed, eyes scanning like a predator watching a herd. Amara walked in, earbuds in, sketchbook in hand. She didn't look at him. She never did. But he stopped her. Not with words. Just with presence. He stepped in front of her, casually, as if he were adjusting his stance, but enough to make her pause. "What's in the bag?" he asked, his tone calm, but firm. "Books." "Art stuff," she replied, already uneasy. "Mind if I take a look?" he added, though his hands were already reaching. She hesitated. That was her personal space. That sketchbook was full of thoughts she hadn't shared with anyone, not even her dad. But she nodded. She didn't want trouble. She didn't want to be that girl, the one who caused a scene. She unzipped her bag halfway and started to show him the contents. But that wasn't enough for him. He took the bag from her hands. Unzipped it fully. Reached in and began pulling things out, one by one, like he was performing a demonstration. Students began to slow down. Watch. Whisper. He pulled out her sketchbook and flipped it open without permission. Pages of art now exposed to strangers, her privacy scattered across the lobby floor. Then he dropped the bag. Just let it fall. Papers scattered. A pencil case burst open. He leaned down slowly, picked up a pen, examined it mockingly. "Well, would you look at that," he said loud enough for the crowd gathering. "No drugs today. HM. That's a surprise." Then came the line, the one that would echo in Amara's mind for weeks. "You're probably hiding something, aren't you? You people always are." There was a pause. The kind of pause where you expect someone, anyone, to speak up. To say, hey, that's not okay. But no one did. The hallway was full. Teachers walked by. Students watched. No one said a word. A few even laughed, awkwardly, nervously, like they were laughing with him just so they wouldn't be next. Amara stood there frozen. Her hands were clenched so tight her knuckles were white. Her lips trembled, but not a single sound escaped. She bent down. Slowly. Picked up her things. One by one. In silence. Her sketchbook last. She didn't look at him. She didn't give him the satisfaction. But her heart pounded like it would break through her chest. She went to class. Sat down. Pretended to focus. But her ears rang. Her throat burned. And her hand kept gripping that pencil so tight it snapped in half. What made it worse wasn't just what he said. It was what everyone else didn't do. The teachers. The administrators. The students. They'd seen it. Heard it. And still, they looked at her as if she were the problem. The system didn't just allow it, it fed it. Protected it. She knew that now. But what Officer Donnelly didn't know, what the whole school didn't know, was that Amara wasn't alone. And her father wasn't just a regular man. When she got home that day, everything changed. Not with screaming. Not with chaos. But with silence. A dangerous, deliberate silence. Malcolm watched her. Listened. And when she finally told him what happened, every word, every insult, every look, his expression didn't change. His body didn't tense. But inside, a line had been crossed. He wasn't just a father anymore. He was a man on a mission. And Eastwood Middle School had no idea what was coming. Amara barely spoke that evening, but her silence screamed. She sat at the kitchen table, fork pushing food she wasn't eating, eyes low, body still. Malcolm watched her from across the room, pretending to read a case file while his mind whirled with 1,000 thoughts. He'd seen that look before. He'd seen it in victims who had just escaped something unspeakable. He'd seen it in interrogations where survivors told stories with their eyes long before their mouths could catch up. He didn't press her. Not yet. He waited, because he knew that the truth, when it came from pain, needed to arrive on its own time. It wasn't until the dishes were washed and the jazz records had stopped spinning that she finally spoke. Her voice was quiet at first, almost hesitant, like she didn't believe she had the right to be angry. He emptied my bag in front of everyone. Malcolm's eyes met hers immediately. She wasn't looking at him, but at the floor. Like she was trying to replay the scene, to understand if she had done something to deserve it. He stayed silent, letting her keep going. He said I was probably hiding something. He said, you people always are, and nobody said anything, Dad. They just watched. Some laughed. I didn't know what to do. Her voice cracked, but she caught it before a tear could fall. Malcolm exhaled slowly, grounding himself. His instincts, sharpened by years of fieldwork, interrogations, deception, were flaring. But this wasn't a case. This was his daughter. This was personal. Did anyone record it? He asked, gently. I think so. Maybe. I saw phones up. But I don't know who posted it. I don't even know their names. He nodded once, slowly. His mind was already working. Timing. Chain of command. Who ran Eastwood Middle's security feeds? Which SROs were assigned? Who oversaw internal affairs for school policing in Baltimore? He knew this wasn't just about confrontation. It had to be airtight. Precise. Unshakable. The next day, while Amara went to school like nothing had happened, like she hadn't been humiliated in front of dozens of peers, Malcolm worked. He didn't go through official channels. Not yet. He used a combination of backdoors, favors owed, and tools only someone with his clearance would know how to navigate. He found the security footage. He watched it on mute. Once. Then twice. He didn't need sound. The expression on Donnelly's face said enough. The way students hesitated. The way no adults intervened. He recorded it onto an encrypted drive and began pulling files. Incident reports. Complaints. Emails. Surveillance logs. Something wasn't right. The deeper he dug, the more patterns emerged. Officer Donnelly had been written up 5 times in the past 3 years, all involving Black or Latino students. None of those reports had moved past the school board. The wording was always the same: situation resolved on site, no action required, misunderstanding between student and staff. But the language wasn't what bothered Malcolm. It was the metadata. All 5 reports had been edited, each one missing its original timestamp. Someone was covering tracks. He didn't say anything to Amara yet. Not even when she came home on Friday and told him Donnelly had smiled at her in the hallway, like nothing had happened. "I think he knows I told you," she said, watching her father carefully. "He doesn't know what I am," Malcolm replied softly. "Not yet." That weekend, Malcolm called in a favor from a former colleague who now worked in cyber investigations. He wanted to track digital evidence, texts between staff, student group chats, anything that could give insight into the social undercurrents of Eastwood Middle. What he found was both illuminating and disturbing. In one group chat titled Eastwood Tea, students shared memes and gossip, but also complaints, anonymous screenshots, whispers of unfair treatment, rumors of favoritism, and in some cases, direct accusations against Donnelly. Most of them were jokes. That was how kids coped. But a few were deadly serious. One message stuck out: he told Marcus he'd search him every day if he didn't cut his hair. Said he looked like a gangbanger. Malcolm had enough to start building a file. He organized everything: footage, records, screenshots, and saved them to a secure cloud. He wasn't ready to go public, but he was getting closer. And then, a week later, something shifted. Amara came home quiet again. But this time, she wasn't just sad. She was furious. "He called me by my first name in front of everyone. Loud. Said, 'Hey, Amara, any contraband today?' like it was funny. The whole class heard him. Even my teacher laughed." She laughed. "Dad," Malcolm felt something burn in his chest. Not just rage, but the unbearable ache of knowing your child has to survive something they should never have to endure. "I'm filing a complaint," he said firmly. "They won't care," Amara snapped, more bitter than he'd ever heard her. "They will," he replied, "because I'm not doing it as your dad. I'm doing it as an agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The next morning, he called the principal. He introduced himself not as Malcolm, not as a concerned parent, but with his full title. He requested a meeting. The tone on the other end of the line changed immediately. Polite. Nervous. Hesitant. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. But Malcolm didn't want a meeting. He wanted a confrontation. And it had to be surgical. Before the meeting, he visited the school as a father. Casually. He walked the halls with Amara. Observed. Took mental notes. Watched Donnelly from a distance. The man didn't even glance in their direction. Which told Malcolm one thing: he still didn't know who he was. Good. He asked Amara about her teachers. Which ones looked the other way? Which ones seemed to enjoy the spectacle? She hesitated before giving names. She didn't want to be that girl. But Malcolm wasn't here to protect egos. He wanted the truth. And the truth, as it turned out, was a tangled web of cowardice, silence, and complicity. The day of the meeting, Malcolm didn't bring lawyers. He brought evidence. He sat down at a polished conference table across from the principal, Donnelly, and 2 board members. He greeted them calmly. He listened as they danced around language. Misunderstanding. Tension. We want to work together. And when they were done, he pulled out a laptop. Played the footage. Slide by slide. Then, he asked one question: do you believe this is how students should be treated in your school? No one answered. He continued. He showed chat logs. Emails. Patterns in complaints. Then he looked directly at Donnelly and said something he hadn't said before: I know who you are. I know what you've done. And I know you thought no one would ever put the pieces together. But they're together now. And trust me, this isn't going away. The room was silent. Donnelly leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, smugness fading. The principal looked pale. One board member tried to shift blame, said she was just made aware. But it didn't matter. Malcolm had what he needed. And he was no longer playing defense. Outside the meeting, Amara sat waiting in the car. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but anticipation. She didn't know what was said inside that room. But when her father came out, he didn't speak for a long moment. Then he smiled, just slightly. This isn't over, he said, but it's about to be, and what happened next would shake the foundation of that school to its core. Because the truth was more dangerous than anyone expected. And Donnelly's secrets? They were about to be exposed. The morning the world turned upside down at Eastwood Middle, everything looked painfully normal. Students shuffled through the halls with earbuds in, backpacks dragging, voices low and tired. A few laughed near the vending machines. Some crammed for tests in the stairwell. Teachers sipped coffee behind classroom doors, going over slides for their next lesson. It was the kind of day that didn't warn you of anything. The sky was clear. The building buzzed like usual. And Officer Donnelly stood near the main office entrance like he always did, hands on his belt, eyes scanning lazily, unaware that his entire illusion of control was about to collapse. Inside the administration conference room, a full school board meeting was already underway. Malcolm sat at the far end of the long table, not in a suit, not as a concerned parent anymore, but in full agent presence, clean-cut, cold-eyed, and patient. The room was packed. School board officials, legal advisors, 2 senior district administrators, the principal, Donnelly himself, and a silent IT technician sat in tight, tense silence as Malcolm plugged in a secure laptop to the projector. No one knew exactly what he'd brought. They only knew he had been gathering something. And that he was no longer asking politely. He clicked once, and the screen lit up with time-stamped footage. The first clip showed the hallway encounter with Amara, high resolution, crystal clear, audio intact. Donnelly's voice echoed through the room, unmistakable. You're probably hiding something, aren't you? You people always are. No one moved. The clip rolled on. Laughter in the background. The way Amara picked up her things in silence. Then it stopped. Malcolm let the silence sit. He didn't explain it. He didn't need to. He turned to Donnelly, who sat with arms folded, mouth set tight. Do you deny this happened? Donnelly scoffed, but his voice wavered. Context matters. I didn't mean, don't finish that sentence unless you're absolutely sure it won't be used against you, Malcolm interrupted, voice low but cutting before Donnelly could respond. Malcolm clicked again. This time, chat logs filled the screen. Not just from students, but from Donnelly's own work computer. A string of messages. Private emails. One labeled Incident Reports with multiple deletions. Another with subject lines like Troublemaker Flagged and Monitor for Gang Behavior, all tied to black students with no disciplinary history. A collective shift moved through the room. The district superintendent leaned forward, whispering something to his assistant. The principal, suddenly pale, avoided eye contact completely. Then came the moment that no one expected. Malcolm pulled up one last file. A voice recording. Not from the school. From Donnelly's home computer, tapped weeks prior through a federal warrant Malcolm had quietly acquired after linking Donnelly to a chain of encrypted communications flagged by an anti-domestic terrorism task force. The audio was grainy, but clear enough. "You think I care about these kids? They're animals. I just show up, smile for the board, and do what I want. Nobody checks. Nobody questions. And if they do, I file another report. Make it look like they snapped. Works every time." The room erupted. Chairs shifted. Gasps rang out. One board member slammed a folder shut and whispered, "He's done," before turning to legal counsel. Donnelly stood, voice rising, hands shaking now. "You can't do this. This is entrapment. That recording is illegal." "No," Malcolm said calmly, "it's federal. And admissible." Donnelly lunged forward, finger pointed across the table. "You think you're some kind of hero? This is a witch hunt. I've served this district for over 15 years, and in 15 years, Malcolm interrupted, standing slowly, "you've assaulted more students with your mouth than most officers do with weapons. You used your position to harass, threaten, and humiliate kids who couldn't fight back. But you picked the wrong one this time. You picked mine." The silence that followed was crushing. Donnelly looked around the room for backup, from the principal, the superintendent, anyone. But no one moved. No one spoke. His reputation had cracked. His power dissolved. His past, now evidence. It was over. He knew it. Before anyone else could speak, there was a knock at the door. 2 plainclothes officers stepped in. One flashed a badge. The room froze again. "Donald Donnelly," the lead officer said, "you are under arrest under federal charges of civil rights violations, abuse of authority, and obstruction of justice." The gasp that followed was so loud it nearly shook the windows. Donnelly turned to Malcolm, face red, voice breaking now, "You did this. This was you." Malcolm's eyes didn't flinch. "No. You did this. I just made sure everyone finally saw it." As Donnelly was cuffed and escorted out, a stunned hush fell across the room. Legal advisors whispered furiously. The principal looked like he might faint. Amara, waiting just outside the office, stood near the window. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just watched as Donnelly passed her, head down, wrists bound, without a single word. Later that day, the story broke. Local news picked it up first. Then regional outlets. By the end of the week, Malcolm had been invited to speak on national media. A federal investigation was launched into the handling of misconduct in school law enforcement. The video went viral. The audio recording aired on primetime television. And Donnelly, stripped of his badge and dignity, sat behind bars as more students came forward with stories, each one more damning than the last. At home, Malcolm finally exhaled. He sat across from Amara in the same kitchen where she'd first told him the truth. But this time, her shoulders weren't slumped. Her eyes weren't low. She was different now. Not because she'd gotten justice. But because she'd seen it. "You did it," she said quietly, "he's gone." Malcolm shook his head. "No. We did it. You stood up. You told me the truth. You gave me something to fight for. And you didn't back down, even when it felt like no one saw you." She looked at him for a long time, then reached across the table and took his hand. "I don't ever want to be invisible again," she said. "You won't," he promised, "not in this house. Not in this city. Not ever again." But as the dust began to settle, a new ripple started to form, one Malcolm hadn't expected. A journalist called. Said she had uncovered something buried deep in the school's hiring records. Something Malcolm hadn't seen. Something even more explosive. The arrest of Officer Donnelly wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Because someone helped him stay hidden all these years. And that person was still sitting comfortably in power. "Oh ChatGPT Ds," Malcolm stared at the email long after the screen had gone dark. The journalist's message was simple, just a few lines, but what it suggested was far from small. Check the name on the original SRO referral documents. The one who signed off on Donnelly's placement at Eastwood. Look deeper into who kept the internal reports buried. There's more than one man behind what happened to your daughter. And I think you already shook the surface. Her name was Lena Wells, a sharp, relentless investigative reporter who'd been covering institutional corruption in Baltimore for years. She was known for exposing deep rot, and when she reached out, it wasn't for speculation. She had something real. Something urgent. Malcolm didn't hesitate. He called her that night. Their conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. Lena spoke fast, with notes in front of her and a voice full of disbelief and fire. She had found archived documentation showing that Donnelly's initial disciplinary history from a previous district had been erased from the hiring packet Eastwood received. Someone had scrubbed it, edited it, replaced incident summaries with generic performance notes. The signature approving his transfer to Eastwood? It belonged to the principal. The same man who had sat quietly in that boardroom. The same man who watched the footage and said nothing. The same man who shook Malcolm's hand and pretended to care about Amara's safety. His name was Kenneth Harland. And he wasn't just a negligent administrator, he was complicit. Malcolm listened in silence, jaw clenched, his mind turning to every meeting, every word, every hesitation he had once thought was simply bureaucratic cowardice. But this wasn't incompetence. It was protection. Harland had shielded Donnelly. Worse, Lena had found financial connections, donations made by an organization linked to a controversial law enforcement fraternity, straight into Eastwood's School Safety Initiative Fund. All of them signed off by Harland. Donnelly had been placed at Eastwood not because he was qualified, but because he fit a mold. A tool. A silent weapon wearing a badge. And Harland had handed him the keys. The next morning, Malcolm didn't tell Amara everything. Not yet. He didn't want her hope to curdle into disillusionment. But she noticed his silence over breakfast, the way he stirred his coffee without drinking it, the way he glanced at his phone every few minutes, waiting. She finally asked what was wrong. He didn't lie. He just said, "It's not over." Not yet. She nodded, sensing the storm that was still building beneath the surface of their small kitchen. At school, the energy had shifted. Donnelly's absence was loud. Students moved differently. Teachers walked on edge. The principal tried to speak at the morning assembly, something about unity and healing, but no one really listened. The students weren't interested in his carefully written speech. They were watching him. And Amara, sitting in the third row, didn't look away once. She knew something else was coming. She could feel it. And that feeling only grew when, later that week, her father called her out of class early and told her to meet him in the car. No explanation. Just urgency. They drove in silence until they reached a small community radio station in the heart of Baltimore. Inside, Malcolm introduced her to Lena. She was young, fierce, dressed like she hadn't slept in 3 days, and her eyes lit up when she saw Amara. "You're the reason we're doing this," Lena said, her voice filled with quiet admiration. Amara blinked, caught off guard. "Me?" "You stood up," Lena continued, "you told the truth. And now it's time we tell the rest of it." The plan was bold. Lena had prepared a live segment, a special investigative report with documents, audio clips, and interviews lined up. She had Malcolm's full testimony recorded. She had a digital paper trail. But what she didn't have, yet, was Amara's voice. Malcolm looked at her gently and asked if she was ready. "You don't have to speak," he said, "not if you're not ready. You've done more than anyone should have had to." Amara didn't hesitate. "I want them to hear me. I want them to know it's not just about Donnelly. It's everyone who let him do it." The segment aired that night. It began with Lena walking listeners through the Donnelly case, the abuse, the audio, the arrest. Then came Malcolm's account, professional and precise. But when Amara spoke, everything shifted. Her voice cracked once or twice, but she didn't stop. She described the fear, the shame, the silence of those around her. And she named the principal. She told the story of how he'd ignored her, how he'd laughed at Donnelly's comment, how he had tried to minimize everything until the walls closed in. She didn't call for revenge. She asked for accountability. The response was immediate. Calls flooded the station. Social media exploded. A local advocacy group called for Harlan's immediate resignation. The school board announced an emergency meeting. By morning, Lena had published the full report on her outlet's site, documents included. And by noon, Harlan was trending. Malcolm received a call from the district's legal office. They wanted to negotiate a quiet exit for Harlan. A resignation, maybe even a letter of apology. They didn't want more public attention. Malcolm listened, then hung up without a word. The next day, he showed up to the board meeting. Not with lawyers. With parents. With students. With teachers who had finally found the courage to speak. The room was full. Harlan sat at the far end, stiff in his chair, eyes sunken, suit too big for the shame now swallowing him. He tried to speak. Said things like miscommunication, unforeseen consequences, in the interest of the students. But no one clapped. No one nodded. Malcolm stood. No more speeches. No more statements. You put a predator in front of our children and gave him permission to hunt. You didn't just fail to protect them, you empowered him. You don't deserve a quiet exit. You deserve to answer. The silence was thick. Then Amara stood too. She didn't speak. She just looked at Harlan. And he couldn't meet her eyes. That night, he resigned under pressure. But it wasn't enough for Malcolm. Because systems don't crumble with one resignation. They collapse when people refuse to look away. So the work continued. With Lena's help, Malcolm launched a task force, parents, teachers, investigators. They reviewed records. Opened sealed files. Reported more names. A slow reckoning began. But in the center of it all was Amara. A girl who once stood in a hallway while the world watched her be torn down. Now standing tall. Seen. Heard. Unshakable. And though the fight wasn't over, one thing was finally, undeniably true, they were listening now. The aftermath wasn't loud. There was no cheering in the streets, no parade, no dramatic curtain call. Justice, when it comes, often arrives in silence, in the form of empty offices, deleted names on websites, or hushed apologies buried in statements that never say enough. But what followed the exposure of Principal Harlan wasn't silence. It was a ripple. A quiet, growing unrest that spread through the entire school district like a pulse that wouldn't settle. Teachers who once turned their heads in the halls now held staff meetings with new urgency. Parents who had been too afraid or too tired to speak up now called board members, demanding answers for years of unanswered complaints. Students whispered less and spoke more boldly. The culture at Eastwood had been disrupted, the old order cracked open, and everyone could feel it. But change, real change, doesn't come without consequence. 2 weeks after Harlan's resignation, Amara received a message slipped into her locker. No name, no signature. Just a handwritten note on lined paper. You think you're better than us now? You made things worse for everyone. Stay quiet next time. It wasn't surprising. Courage always comes with backlash. Malcolm saw it for what it was, fear disguised as hostility, but he didn't brush it off. He reported it. Escalated it. Refused to let intimidation become normal. But what unsettled him more was the whispering that followed. Not just among students, but teachers. He noticed it during pickup. He noticed it in school board meetings. People spoke to him more cautiously now. Carefully. Like they were waiting for him to mess up, or for the next headline to bury the last one. Lena's article had sparked a statewide debate about law enforcement in schools. Politicians scrambled to distance themselves. Some called for the complete removal of school officers, others argued for reforms, training, diversity audits. Malcolm was invited onto panels, forums, podcasts. People wanted his voice, but only to the extent that it fit their narrative. The same systems that had ignored him as a black father now held microphones to his mouth, eager to broadcast his pain but unwilling to share his power. It didn't sit right. He didn't want to become a symbol. He wanted results. Policies. Reform. Protection. Amara, meanwhile, returned to her routine, or tried to. Her friends had changed. Not all of them, but enough that she noticed. Some looked at her differently now. With admiration. With distance. One of them, Jamal, sat next to her in math and whispered, "You're like famous now," with a smile. But another, Lila, stopped speaking to her altogether. When Amara asked why, Lila said quietly, "My mom said your dad made things worse. That now teachers are afraid to even look at us the wrong way." That one sentence stung more than any note. Not because it was cruel, but because it showed how easily people confuse discomfort with oppression. How even those you thought were friends can shrink when you shine light on something they'd rather keep hidden. At home, Amara spent more time drawing again. Not just for comfort, but for clarity. Her sketches became sharper. Bolder. One night, Malcolm found a page on the kitchen table. It showed a hallway, empty, except for a lone girl standing with her back to the viewer. The shadow in front of her wasn't a person, but a towering shape made of file cabinets, reports, keys, handcuffs, and cameras. He stared at it for a long time. It told him everything he needed to know about what she was carrying. The fight wasn't over, not for her. The district launched an internal audit. They reviewed hiring records, complaint logs, staff evaluations. 3 other schools were flagged for similar patterns, officers with previous misconduct quietly reassigned rather than disciplined. Malcolm was called in to consult. He attended the first meeting, listened carefully, and then asked one question: what happens to the kids they left behind? The room went quiet. No one had an answer. Because the system wasn't built to clean up after itself. It was built to survive itself. That's when Malcolm proposed something radical. A community oversight committee, formed not by board members, but by parents, students, and educators. A panel with access to complaint records, hiring protocols, and the power to vote on school officer placements. He didn't want symbolic changes. He wanted structural ones. The idea was met with resistance, not openly, but in the slow deflections that come with political fear. "We'll review it. We need to assess feasibility. Let's form a subcommittee." He'd heard it all before. But this time, he had leverage. He had the public. He had truth. And more than that, he had Amara, living, breathing proof of what silence costs. But something else was brewing. Lena had continued digging. She discovered that the organization funneling money into the school's safety fund had ties to a national police lobbying group with a history of shielding officers from accountability. Their donations weren't just generous, they were strategic. In exchange, they gained influence over school safety policy, officer selection, and even curriculum related to discipline. Harland had been their local asset. Donnelly was just one of many names passed down the line. Lena brought the evidence to Malcolm in a sealed file. He flipped through pages, growing more sick with every document. Emails between Harland and regional donors. Requests for discreet placement. Internal memos advising caution about activist parents. It was bigger than Eastwood. It was a system built on avoidance. Control. Appearances. And now, the decision loomed: take this public and risk igniting a political war, or go quiet and settle for the justice they'd already won. Malcolm sat with it for days. He wrestled with it in bed, on walks, during long silences while driving Amara to school. He spoke to Lena. To other parents. He even called an old FBI colleague who once blew the whistle on a cover-up and was forced out quietly. The man told him, "They won't ruin you, but they'll try to discredit you just enough to make you irrelevant." That stuck with him. The threat wasn't losing, it was being erased. Amara noticed his distance. One evening, she sat beside him, looked him in the eye, and said, "You're scared." Malcolm didn't deny it. "Yeah," he said, "because I've seen what happens when you poke the wrong bear." "But you already did," she said, her voice soft but steady. "And it changed everything." He looked at her for a long moment. She wasn't a little girl anymore. She had grown, not because she wanted to, but because the world forced her to. She had faced humiliation and chose dignity. She had been pushed down and chose voice. She didn't need him to protect her from the truth. She needed him to fight it. The next morning, Malcolm called Lena and gave her the green light. She published the story with everything, names, connections, records, quotes. It hit hard. National outlets picked it up. Political figures distanced themselves. Some demanded full investigations. Others accused Malcolm of endangering community trust. It didn't matter. The fire had already started. This time, it couldn't be buried. But with the truth came consequences. Malcolm received threats. Emails. Letters. A brick through his car window. Amara's school offered her a transfer, for her own safety. She refused. Said she wouldn't leave the place she'd helped change. Lena was targeted too, calls to her editor, pressure from donors, attempts to discredit her sources. But the public was louder. Support poured in. Marches were organized. Meetings were packed. A movement had begun, one neither Malcolm nor Amara had asked for, but now carried with everything they had. And beneath it all, the core question remained, how far do you go to fight something bigger than you? When you win a battle, do you walk away, or do you keep swinging, knowing the war might never really end? Malcolm didn't have an answer yet. But he was about to make a decision that would define the rest of his life. The threat started to get personal. Not vague insults or anonymous messages anymore, but direct, sharp, and unmistakably calculated. A photo of Amara slipped under their door one morning, her face circled in red ink with the words, "Watch her," scrawled across the bottom. An envelope in Malcolm's mailbox with a fake subpoena demanding he cease interference in educational affairs, signed by a made-up name but bearing the exact logo of the district board. He brought them to the police, of course, but he already knew how it would go. The officer at the desk nodded slowly, took notes, offered to keep an eye on things, and filed it away. That was it. No follow-up. No investigation. Just a smile that didn't reach his eyes and a hand that gently guided Malcolm back out the door. He knew the signs. That wasn't disinterest, it was avoidance. They didn't want to get involved because it meant choosing a side. At home, Malcolm tried not to let it show. He cooked like usual. Sat with Amara during homework. Talked about school, music, even bad cafeteria food. But she could see it in his face, in the way he double-locked the door now, in the hesitation before he answered phone calls, in how he kept his sidearm closer than usual even in the house. One night she finally asked, "Are we safe?" And the silence that followed said more than any answer could. He nodded eventually, said they were, and tried to mean it. But Amara wasn't a child anymore, and she knew what fear looked like, even when it wore her father's face. Still, she refused to back down. At school, she joined the student equity group. She organized a forum. Helped other students draft a letter demanding transparent hiring policies for school officers. The principal who replaced Harland, a woman named Dr. Keyes, was cautious but supportive. She had inherited chaos and tried to steer it without crashing. She invited Malcolm to speak at the school. He hesitated at first, unsure if his presence would inspire or divide. But Amara encouraged him. "Let them see your face," she said. "They need to see we're still here." So he went. He stood before an auditorium full of students, teachers, and parents. And when he spoke, he didn't lecture. He didn't yell. He told the story. All of it. And then he said something that left the room frozen: this isn't about one officer. It's about every adult who chooses silence over justice. Every administrator who says, maybe next year. Every board that fears bad press more than bad policy. My daughter was humiliated because a system made it easy. She found her voice because I taught her how to use it. But she shouldn't have had to. When he finished, the applause didn't come right away. But when it did, it was real. Loud. Earnest. For a brief moment, it felt like something had shifted. And yet, Malcolm knew better than to think a standing ovation meant the work was done. Lena, meanwhile, was under pressure from her editors. There was talk of moving on, of shifting focus to other issues. She called Malcolm one evening, frustration bubbling in her voice. "They say we've done enough. That the public wants something new. But this isn't finished, Malcolm. We can't stop now." He agreed. But he also saw the toll it was taking on her. She had been harassed online, accused of having a vendetta, and even followed once on her way home. She had become the enemy for people who couldn't accept the truth. He told her to be careful. She told him she wouldn't run. They were both too deep now to pretend neutrality was an option. Then came the school board election. What had once been a routine local vote now carried the weight of a community reckoning. Malcolm had no intention of running, he wasn't a politician, didn't crave power, but parents kept asking. Students begged. "If you don't run, they'll win by default," one mother told him. And she was right. The old guard was mobilizing again. Quietly. Subtly. With whispers about overreach, outside influence, divisive politics. They wanted things to go back to the way they were, not because it was better, but because it was easier. Amara was the one who changed his mind. She came home one afternoon, placed a printed article in front of him, a smear piece written by a conservative blog accusing Malcolm of undermining school safety and training students to distrust authority. Her eyes were fierce when she said, "If they're this scared of you, then maybe that means you're exactly who we need in that room." He didn't respond immediately. He stared at the page. Then at her. And he realized something: this wasn't just his fight anymore. It had become theirs. He announced his candidacy that weekend. The campaign was small, grassroots, but powerful. Lena helped quietly behind the scenes. Former students volunteered. Parents went door to door. The platform was simple: transparency, accountability, protection for all students. Malcolm didn't promise miracles. He promised work. And people believed him, not because he told them to, but because he had already done it. The other side fought back hard. Ads appeared accusing him of politicizing education. One radio host claimed he was trying to defund school safety. Malcolm responded with facts. Videos. Public records. He didn't yell. He didn't smear. He let the truth speak for itself. Amara joined him at every rally. Her voice had grown stronger too, more certain. She told her story again and again, not with bitterness, but with clarity. She was no longer the girl in the hallway. She had become a symbol, not of victimhood, but of resilience. Then, 2 weeks before the election, someone broke into their car. Nothing was stolen. Not the stereo, not the GPS, not even the small stack of campaign flyers on the back seat. But the glove box was open. The documents Malcolm kept there, his daily planner, some handwritten notes, were gone. It was a message. And he got it loud and clear. This was no longer just about schools. It was about power. Territory. Control. And someone out there was willing to get personal to stop him. He considered stepping back. Just for a moment. Not because he was afraid, but because he was tired. Exhausted, really. The weight of leading something you never asked for, the endless pushing against walls that always rebuild themselves. That night, he sat on the balcony, staring out into the city, and whispered, "Is it worth it?" He didn't expect an answer. But Amara stepped out, sat beside him, and said, "If we stop, what happens to the next kid who gets pulled out of line for no reason? What happens to the girl who doesn't have a dad like you?" He didn't speak. He just nodded, the silence between them heavy with understanding. The next morning, Malcolm returned to the campaign trail, not louder, not angrier, but sharper. Focused. He stopped trying to win over those who would never listen. He spoke to the ones who had been waiting for someone to speak for them. The janitor who'd seen things and never said a word. The teacher who kept warning about Donnelly years ago. The counselor who had filed complaints that vanished. The parents who stayed home during meetings because they thought their voices didn't count. He told them it did. And slowly, they believed him. The final debate was held in the school auditorium, the same one where Malcolm had first spoken weeks earlier. The room was packed. The old board members sat on one side. Malcolm stood on the other. When asked what made him qualified, he didn't list titles. He didn't mention the FBI. He simply said, "I fought for my daughter when no one else did. And I'm here to make sure you never have to fight alone again." The crowd erupted. But behind the applause, Malcolm felt it, the tension still rising. Because the fight wasn't over. The election was near. The stakes were real. And the enemy wasn't one man anymore. It was a system. A culture. A belief that silence was safer than truth. And in just a few days, the people would have to decide, would they go back to what was easy? Election day arrived draped in a thick gray morning haze that refused to lift, like the city itself was holding its breath. East Baltimore felt slower that day. Quieter. But underneath that stillness was a current of something different, not tension, not fear exactly, but expectation. Something was coming. Something real. Malcolm woke up before dawn, dressed in silence, his mind already replaying the steps of the day before they had begun. Amara watched him from the kitchen table as she tied her braids. She didn't ask how he felt because she already knew. His eyes were steady but not calm. He'd carried this weight for months now, and while he never showed the cracks, they were there, hiding in the way he double-checked every email, every route to the community centers, every detail of his schedule like he was still in the field, preparing for a takedown that could go wrong at any moment. They drove to their polling place together in a borrowed van, wrapped in campaign stickers and handwritten signs made by local kids. The parking lot was already crowded. People stood in line with folding chairs and umbrellas, wrapped in scarves and coats, determined to be counted. An older man passed by them, nodded, and said, "I'm not here because I believe in the system. I'm here because you gave me a reason to believe again." Malcolm didn't know what to say. He simply placed a hand over his heart and nodded. These weren't political supporters. These were survivors of a broken promise, people who'd been told their voices didn't matter until someone reminded them that silence was not safety, it was surrender. Inside, the line moved slowly. Malcolm kept his head low, trying not to draw too much attention, but it didn't help. People approached him every few minutes, whispering words of hope, encouragement, even apology. One teacher, an older white woman who had worked at Eastwood for nearly 20 years, placed a hand on his arm and said, "I saw what Donnelly did. I saw it happen to so many kids. I stayed quiet because I was scared. I'm sorry. I should have done more." Malcolm didn't flinch. He didn't absolve her. He simply looked at her and said, "Then do more now." She nodded, eyes wet, and returned to the line. Back outside, the clouds had thickened. Rain threatened to fall, but no one moved. More volunteers showed up. Students waved handmade posters. Journalists hovered at the edges, cameras tucked discreetly against their chests. Lena stood near the entrance, eyes scanning, always working, always alert. She made her way over, clipboard in hand, face serious. "We're hearing rumors the opposition might try to dispute the vote count," she said under her breath. "They're already floating claims about improper influence and biased media." Malcolm took a breath and looked at her. "Of course they are. They don't know how to win without control." She nodded, a bitter smile forming. "You ready?" "No," he said. "But we're here anyway." The day crawled forward. Malcolm visited every precinct he could. Shook every hand. Answered every question. But he could feel the weight of eyes on him, not just friendly ones. There was a car that passed by him 3 times near one polling station. The same black SUV. He clocked it each time, memorizing the plates. At one point, he leaned in and whispered to Amara, "Stay with Lena. Don't be alone today." She didn't argue. She had felt it too, the cold undercurrent in the air, the knowledge that people desperate to maintain power will often act when they believe they're losing it. That night, they gathered at the local rec center. Not a hotel ballroom or a rented event hall, just a humble community space with folding tables, string lights, and the smell of baked ziti and nervous sweat. Families showed up. Friends. Teachers. Kids with cell phones raised to the ceiling, live streaming on shaky hands. The screen on the far wall displayed early results in real time. Malcolm didn't watch it. Not really. He sat near the back, beside Amara, hands folded, back straight. He didn't speak unless spoken to. Every time the screen flipped to a new percentage, the room gasped or sighed. But he stayed still. Like a man who knew the storm wasn't over no matter which direction the wind shifted. Then, near midnight, the final count came in. It wasn't a landslide. It wasn't a sweeping declaration. It was a slim, hard-earned, razor-edge victory. Enough. Just enough. The room exploded. Cheers, laughter, tears. People hugged each other, cried openly, shouted his name. Malcolm stood slowly, not out of shock but out of restraint. He raised his hand, asking for quiet. The room hushed, eager to hear what he'd say. He cleared his throat and looked at them all, the parents who had been dismissed, the kids who had been hurt, the teachers who had stayed, the ones who came forward, the ones still afraid. "We didn't win tonight because we out-yelled them," he said, his voice deep and steady. "We won because we told the truth. And the truth still matters." He paused, let the words settle. "But don't think this is the end. Winning an election doesn't fix what they broke. It just gives us the power to do something about it. So tomorrow, we start." Amara clapped first. Then the rest followed. He didn't stay long after that. Too many people. Too much noise. He slipped out the side door with Amara and Lena, the cold air outside a welcome contrast to the thick heat of the celebration. They walked slowly toward the van, the moon peeking through the clouds like a witness to everything that had unfolded. Amara leaned her head on his shoulder as they walked. "You really did it," she whispered. "No," Malcolm said, wrapping an arm around her. "We did it. And we're not done yet." They drove home through quiet streets. The city looked different at night, softer somehow, like it, too, was tired of carrying the weight. When they got home, Malcolm locked the door behind them like always. But this time, it wasn't out of fear. It was out of habit. He looked around their apartment. The kitchen light left on. A plate in the sink. A sketchbook left open on the table. It wasn't perfect. But it was peace. At least for tonight. He walked over to the sketchbook. Amara had drawn something new. A crowd of students standing in front of a crumbling wall. One of them, her, held a hammer. Behind the wall was sunlight. He smiled, slowly, and sat down beside it. This wasn't just about a cop. Or a principal. Or a school board seat. This was about dismantling something that had stood for too long and letting new light in. But even as the night quieted around them, Malcolm knew the work had just begun. Because with every wall torn down, someone would always be waiting to rebuild it. Months passed. The temperature changed, the city moved on, and still, the ripples from what had happened at Eastwood continued to echo far beyond its walls. But something had shifted, not in the headlines, not in the politics, but in the hearts of the people who had lived it. Amara walked the halls of her school now without her shoulders tense or eyes cast down. The same walls that once closed in on her now felt different, not because they were new, but because she had transformed them. Students nodded at her in quiet respect. Younger kids looked up to her. Even teachers who once ignored her presence now asked her opinion in front of the whole class. She didn't seek popularity. She didn't crave attention. But there was a kind of power in being seen, truly seen, and she carried that power with grace. She was chosen to represent her school at a statewide youth summit. She stood in front of strangers, adults, educators, policymakers, and told her story without flinching. Her voice, once silenced by fear, now commanded rooms. When she spoke, people leaned in. Not because she was loud, but because every word she chose carried weight. After her speech, a woman approached her in tears and said, "You reminded me why I became a teacher." Amara simply smiled, thanked her, and walked away quietly. She wasn't doing this for recognition. She was doing it for every student who still felt voiceless. She had become more than a survivor, she was a force of nature. Malcolm's term on the school board started with resistance. He faced opposition, red tape, long meetings where people danced around words instead of speaking the truth. But he never flinched. He came prepared. Every policy he introduced was backed by research, community testimony, and precedent. He didn't shout over people. He waited, then responded with clarity that dismantled arguments from the inside out. Slowly, the old guard crumbled. Allies emerged. The board evolved. And his proposals, once seen as radical, became the new foundation. One of his first major victories was the approval of the Community Oversight Committee, the very one he had once proposed and been told was impossible. It now included student representatives, parent advocates, and even former staff members who had witnessed misconduct but lacked support. They reviewed officer conduct, hiring decisions, and safety policies. Real accountability, finally rooted in the people most affected. Lena continued to publish. After the Eastwood case, she was offered a national position, a job that would have taken her away from Baltimore, from the community that trusted her. She declined. She stayed. Not out of fear, but out of purpose. She created an investigative podcast called Unseen, dedicated to stories like Amara's, the quiet injustices buried in the cracks of everyday systems. The first season focused entirely on school policing. It became a sensation. National awards followed. But she never forgot why she started. She credited Malcolm and Amara in every interview. And when asked if she was afraid of backlash, she replied, "Not anymore. Because truth is louder now." As for Donnelly, he remained in custody pending trial. But his downfall didn't end with him. His arrest exposed a chain of misconduct across multiple districts. Investigations were launched. Settlements reached. Policies rewritten. The name, Donnelly, became less a person and more a warning, a symbol of what happens when power is left unchecked. He would no longer walk school halls. He would no longer hide behind a badge. And for once, justice didn't feel like a myth. It felt tangible. Harland, the former principal, faced a different kind of justice. Legal action was slow, but accountability found its way. His credentials were suspended. He lost his pension. His name, once respected in education circles, now carried shame. He attempted to defend himself in a public letter, but it only drew more scrutiny. Eventually, he faded from public view, a cautionary tale for those who protect power over people. 1 year later, Eastwood Middle celebrated the anniversary of the reforms with an open assembly. Families gathered. Students performed. Teachers shared stories of change. Malcolm was invited to speak again, but this time, he declined. Instead, he asked Amara to take the stage. She walked up, calm and grounded, holding nothing but a worn sketchbook in her hand. She opened it, flipped to the same drawing her father once found on their table, the wall crumbling, the light shining through. She held it up for everyone to see. "We didn't just tear down a wall," she said, "we built something new. And now it's our job to protect it." The crowd rose to their feet. It wasn't thunderous or chaotic, it was full of reverence, as if they understood the weight of what she was saying. She wasn't asking for applause. She was asking for commitment. Later that night, back at home, Malcolm sat on the couch beside her, both of them quiet. The room was filled with soft jazz, the kind her mother used to love before she left. Amara turned to him and asked, "Do you think people really change?" He thought for a long time before answering. "I don't think change is something that happens to people," he said. "I think it's something they choose. Every day. Even when it's hard. Especially then." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and for the first time in a long time, they both exhaled, not because the fight was over, but because they had survived the hardest part together. "Now, I want you to sit with this story for a moment. Really sit with it. Because this wasn't just about one man abusing power, or one child being humiliated, or one family seeking justice. This was about a truth many of us already know but are too tired or too scared to confront, that silence protects injustice, and courage dismantles it. That systems don't change until we force them to look at what they've done. That healing doesn't come from punishment alone, but from rebuilding something stronger in its place." How many Amaras have walked into classrooms and been made to feel small? How many Malcolms have been told their fight was too loud, too aggressive, too inconvenient? And how many of us have seen injustice and turned our eyes away, convincing ourselves someone else would fix it? Now ask yourself, what would you have done? Would you have stood up? Would you have spoken? Would you have stayed silent? Let this story be a reminder that real change starts when the right person refuses to back down at the wrong moment. That sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is tell the truth, again and again, until the world is forced to listen. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you feel something deep in your chest, share it. Talk about it. Reflect on it. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories that uncover the unseen, confront the uncomfortable, and deliver the twist that justice demands, then subscribe to Tales of Twist and hit the like button. Because the world needs more truth, and we're just getting started.